Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Vin, and this is another edition of Fresh Red Kills. So, Fresh Red Kills is where I talk about the books that I have recently completed reading. And that would be two for this edition. I'm going to be talking about Johnny Tremain by Esther Forbes and Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. So first, Johnny Tremain. I'd originally planned on reading this for middle grade March. Didn't get to it then, but still wanted to read it, so I read it in April. And yeah, my son, maybe 2 months ago, he's in fourth grade, and he was doing a whole unit on the American Revolution. So I decided, watch some maybe movies about it with him, so we can get more of a visual sense of the way people dressed, how it was. And one of the movies that we watched together was the Disney version of Johnny Tremain from the late 1950s, and it was it was definitely of its time. He enjoyed it overall, but it did make me curious about the book itself. There are a lot of younger people's. I don't want to say necessarily young adult. I'm not always entirely sure where some of these things fall in. Um, but some historical fiction that I kind of missed when I was growing up that I figured I'd go back to and read. I do also teach middle school, so it does help give me kind of more of a sense as far as reading level, and possibly even gives me some recommendations for students. And so I read this, and I guess I was very impressed. Originally published in 1943, I know it's an old cliche, but it's a lot better than the movie. The movie was super hyper patriotic and everything. This one definitely, it's it's a little bit more understanding in certain ways of the British perspective. Of course, it is an American narrative, um, but I thought that Forbes did a very good job of capturing the time period and many of the attitudes. Um, and Johnny Tremain as a central character is actually really interesting. So it takes place in Boston. Um, we see at the very early stages of the Revolution. We do in this see the Boston Tea Party. We see at least the after effects of the battles of Lexington and Concord. So really when the war is first breaking out. And during this time, Johnny Tremain is growing. He begins as an apprentice to a silversmith, but then due to an accident, which leaves his hand badly burned, he can't practice silversmithing anymore. So he's sort of destitute on his own. He doesn't have any family. And he ends up falling in with the revolutionaries eventually. And Forbes does a really good job of showing Tremain's maturity. Of course, it deals with the American Revolution, so he does have a political awakening. But it's not just that. He also matures in the way that he approaches people. He's less judgmental. He's less rash to conclusions. We see him just kind of overall start to treat people more kindly. And she does a really good job of doing that. The British are not entirely demonized. He meets some British that he actually kind of likes. She actually kind of presents the British and the Americans in a way in which they are not entirely different. They are seen to be essentially the same people, of course, with different political agendas. But otherwise, there's not always a clear distinction. When she does present the conflict between the Patriots and the British, but also, unlike the movie, this also focuses a lot on the Loyalists as well. Um, it seems to be couched more in terms not necessarily of rights, but of class. Uh, we see the Loyalists generally being of a higher class, and Tremain and his compatriots being apprentices, often quite poor, of limited means and limited avenues to success. We see the kind of breaking away of the British Empire as maybe a way to create more opportunities for people. So it's much more about, I think, classism in here than it is about any kind of philosophical um, understandings of the rights of man. And maybe that's what it was. Maybe for people who were not John Adams and John Hancock and all those people, maybe that's really what it was like, possibly. But it certainly is presented in a way where the reader, even a younger reader, would kind of, I think, get it. They would understand it. I was glad to see that Forbes actually did address slavery in here. She shows slaves in Boston. And, you know, of course, this is 1940s, so we expect, you know, not the most modern attitudes, but she does a pretty good job, I think, overall. And Tremain, in the very beginning, you see him treating uh, a slave boy pretty harshly. I mean, you know, just because he's a slave, because of the skin color. And we do see Tremain start wrestling with that later on, and stop, you know, not quite judging people as quickly based on the way that they look or their position. Forbes does fall into that that old trope that writers used to use quite often at this time, where the slaves would have that kind of stereotypical slave dialect. Even, you know, if these are people who grew up in Boston, they'd somehow speak like, you know, like they were on a plantation somewhere in South Carolina. But otherwise, I mean, that's kind of a minor gripe, just a, you know, something of the period. Um, but yeah, you know, we see Johnny Tremain. He is a relative of a very rich loyalist family, the Lights, and he kind of tries to get in their good graces at one point, but we see him also starting to let go of that. And it seems like, you know, she's using a lot of opportunities in here, including that, to symbolize not just Johnny Tremain letting go of this loyalist British past, but also the Americans letting go of their British ancestry. You know, or at least, you know, pushing that away and starting anew. And yeah, there was a nice little quote in here. It was page 49 that I kind of liked, and it had to do with his age. And a woman asks him, "How old are you, Johnny?" 16. "And what's that? A boy or a man?" He laughed. "A boy in time of peace and a man in time of war." That is certainly true. And just to wrap this up, again, I really did actually like this quite a bit. Almost in the last page, um, she ends up writing something that I thought was probably really for a World War II crowd. I wrote down over here too. I've got a little note here. Um, she writes, "Please God, out of this New England soil, such men would forever rise up, ready to fight when need came, one generation after the other." And I can only imagine, again, that people in 1943 would certainly be thinking of the current war at that time, um, with that in mind. But anyway, I was actually very impressed by this. Um, in that book, Johnny mentions that he grew up reading with his mother, and one of the things that he had read was Robinson Crusoe. And then in the book, he's in a private library reading, and he reads it again, and it made me realize, like, I've never read Robinson Crusoe. It's always been on my list, something to get to. Originally published in 1719, at least one of the contenders for the, you know, earliest English novel. I don't know much about that whole debate, but I know that there maybe are some others that people would suggest. But generally accepted, this is certainly one of the first that we would consider a novel, I guess. Um, so I figured, you know, this is a good time as any. This is the Everyman Library edition from 1992, and you know, very nice. It's got the ribbon, um, very well. The binding's great. Yeah, and I didn't know what to expect. It's 1719. I have read some other books from the 18th century. A lot of them been Gothic, which of course is very floral writing and you know, certain weird tropes. I have read, however, Defoe's Moll Flanders. I read that a couple of years ago, and I really liked that. Actually, I thought that was pretty good. I wasn't sure how, you know, how this would read, and it actually reads very well. It's very easy. Um, and sorry, I'm just trying to grab some stuff over here. Uh, Crusoe is an interesting character. He's sort of an idiot in a lot of ways, at least at first. He readily admits that the problems that he ends up getting into, of course, culminating in being trapped on a deserted island, um, you know, out in the Caribbean somewhere, probably Southern Caribbean, that it's him making kind of dumb, rash decisions. So he gets in trouble a couple times early in the novel. He's recounting this as an old man, and about, you know, his times basically in the mid 1600s. And of course, he does end up on that deserted island. On his way, he was going to get slaves. Uh, so the slave trade is alive and well, certainly within this. Early on in the novel, he himself is enslaved by Moors. So slavery is just for this time period, just a fact of life, that people enslave each other. Uh, he does, of course, end up on his island, having to survive. He luckily has all kinds of things land with him with the ship. He pretty much never has to go without. He does complain about sometimes not having to do things or having to do stuff, to survive. But for the most part, he, for somebody who's trapped on a desert island, he lives a relatively comfortable life. A great chunk of the book is really just what he did, when he did it, the different animals that he finds. He somehow finds goats on this island. I can only assume that they were left there from earlier travelers. Defoe doesn't always have a very good sense sometimes of what kind of animals are where. I got that impression certainly in this. And Defoe does seem to have modeled a lot of this after a Scotsman who had been trapped on an island, I think in the South Pacific, but where there had been goats that again had been left by a previous ship, and he, made a bunch of goat skins for as an outfit. And Crusoe ends up doing the same thing, although it doesn't really make sense because he's like in the tropics. Why he would walk around with goat skins all the time, heavy goat skins. This doesn't really make sense. Part of the novel, which is kind of interesting, at least early on, when Crusoe is trapped on his island, he is going back looking through his journal that he was keeping, and he presents the journal. He presents commentary with that journal, which I thought was kind of an interesting literary device for the time. And then eventually, we do kind of start going through large swaths of time. There are local cannibals that occasionally will land on the island, and he is always afraid of how to deal with that. So much of this book, though, is about Crusoe's sort of religious awakening, I guess you can say. He didn't think too much about religion beforehand, but the ship that he crash landed on, I think had a couple of Bibles in it. So he's reading the Bibles, and he kind of develops this whole new spiritual sense and dedication to God. Although it is, of course, all from desperation and fear. And one aspect of Crusoe that I find kind of interesting, and there's certain points where I couldn't tell if what I was reading was meant to be taken entirely seriously or if it was satire, because some things are kind of ridiculous. And that especially is every time he meets somebody, they basically will pledge their absolute loyalty to him. I don't know what it is about this character, but everybody he meets, no matter what background they have, no matter what nationality or ethnicity or what language or religion, they all basically end up saying, "We will follow you to the ends of the earth." And that gets kind of ridiculous, and I wasn't quite sure if I was meant to take all of that seriously. But the way that Crusoe talks about people and things, a gun that he finds is not too different from a person that he finds. It's entirely around what needs they can provide for him. How can they service him? He's never asking, how can I help these other people, really. It's always, how can these people help me? And he approaches everything in that way, including religion at times, but the people he meets, the animals he finds, it's always about how he can be served by them. So he's a very selfish individual throughout the entire book, really. But there's moments that I certainly enjoyed. I did overall like the book, for what it was. One of my big gripes is he talks about he has a dog with him for a really long time. He hardly ever talks about the thing. If I was trapped on an island and my main companion was a dog, I'd probably be writing about that dog all the time. Like, what did the dog do that day? What did he sniff? What did he find? Were we playing on the beach? I can't help think of Tom Hanks in a Castaway, and Wilson the volleyball floating away, and how devastated he was just by that not inanimate, companion. If it was an actual dog, I feel like he would be way more devastated by that dog's death. But which does happen with old age. He's here. He's on the island for a long time. But when we do finally get to the point where he is looking like he might be able to get off this island, and there's other individuals, I thought that stuff was actually quite well written. A nice tense cat and mouse game that ends up occurring. So yeah, I'm glad I read it. It's a fine novel. I don't see myself necessarily going back to it again. I think I like Moth Landers better. But I'm glad I read it. I'm glad I read both of these, in fact. So yeah, the two that I read or finished, recently in the month of April, we got Johnny Tremain by Esther Forbes and Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. If you have any thoughts on these, I'd love to hear them. As always, thank you, BookTube.